In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, Alexandra Crawford had everything money could buy. A penthouse overlooking Central Park, a collection of rare art that would make museums jealous, and a husband whose fortune rivaled small countries' GDPs. But beneath the surface of this perfect life lurked a web of secrets, betrayal, and a past she couldn't escape. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When Alexandra's body was discovered in their Hamptons estate, the investigation revealed a shocking truth. $7 million had been siphoned from her husband's accounts to a charity run by her ex-husband, a man she had sworn never to speak to again. Was this a crime of passion, a calculated revenge, or something far more sinister that would shake the foundations of New York's wealthiest families? This is the story of how Alexandra Crawford's secret philanthropy signed her death warrant. The morning of June 17, 2023, began like any other Saturday for the residents of Sandpiper Lane in Southampton. The exclusive oceanfront community was just waking up to the gentle sounds of waves crashing against pristine beaches. Security guards made their routine rounds, gardeners tended to immaculate lawns, and personal chefs prepared breakfast for the wealthy homeowners. At 7:43 a.m., a piercing scream cut through the tranquil morning air. Greta Martinez, the longtime housekeeper for the Crawford estate, had arrived earlier than usual that morning. Mr. Crawford was away on business in Tokyo, and Mrs. Crawford had mentioned wanting to get an early start on preparations for a charity gala she was hosting the following weekend. I called out for Mrs. Crawford when I arrived, Greta later told detectives, her hands trembling as she recounted the events. When she didn't answer, I thought maybe she was still sleeping, but then I saw the French doors leading to the patio were open, and there was blood on the marble floor. Alexandra Crawford lay face down on the sandstone patio, still dressed in her silk pajamas, a pool of blood surrounding her head. The autopsy would later reveal she had been struck repeatedly with a heavy object, later identified as a limited edition Crystal Award that Marshall Crawford had received for his philanthropic work, an irony that wouldn't be lost on investigators. Detective Vanessa Rodriguez was the first senior officer on the scene. A veteran of the Southampton Police Department's Homicide Division, she had investigated her fair share of domestic disputes among the wealthy. But something about this case felt different from the moment she stepped onto the property. The house was immaculate, Rodriguez noted in her initial report. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of robbery. The victim's jewelry was still on her body, including a 15-carat diamond ring that could have paid for my retirement 10 times over. This wasn't a break-in gone wrong. Marshall Crawford was informed of his wife's death while boarding his return flight from Tokyo. Security footage from Narita International Airport captured the moment, his face draining of color, his knees buckling as an airport staff member helped him to a private lounge. He was 6,000 to 700 miles away when his wife was murdered, with dozens of witnesses placing him at a business dinner that had run late into the Tokyo night. "My wife had no enemies," Marshall insisted through tears when he was interviewed by Detective Rodriguez upon his return to the United States. Everyone loved Alexandra. She was generous, kind-hearted. She devoted her life to helping others. Marshall Crawford was the epitome of American success, a self-made tech billionaire who had transformed a startup in his garage into Crawford Tech, now a global leader in cybersecurity software. At 53, he was 20 years older than his wife, a fact that had fueled gossip among New York's elite when they married 5 years earlier. Their relationship seemed perfect on the surface, said Olivia Thompson, Alexandra's closest friend and fellow board member at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Marshall adored her. He would have given her the world if she asked for it. But lately, something had changed. Alexandra seemed distracted, anxious even. When I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and changed the subject. The investigation into Alexandra's murder took a surprising turn when forensic accountants, brought in to review the family's finances as standard procedure, discovered unusual transfers from one of Marshall's lesser-used business accounts. Over the past 18 months, approximately $7 million had been moved through a series of offshore accounts before ultimately landing at the Renewal Foundation, a non-profit organization focused on rehabilitation programs for former inmates. What made this discovery significant was the Foundation's executive director, James Whitman, Alexandra Crawford's first husband. We were completely blindsided by this information, Detective Rodriguez recounted in a press conference months later. Neither Mr. Crawford nor anyone in Alexandra's circle had mentioned a previous marriage. It had been carefully scrubbed from her public biography. James and Alexandra Whitman, née Parker, had been college sweethearts at Columbia University. They married young, with James pursuing a law degree while Alexandra worked as an elementary school teacher in Harlem. Their marriage lasted 7 years before ending in what court records described as an amicable divorce, though friends of the couple would later reveal it was anything but amicable. After the divorce, James Whitman's career took an unexpected turn. Following a spiritual awakening, he abandoned corporate law to establish the Renewal Foundation, dedicating his life to helping former prisoners reintegrate into society. The foundation struggled financially for years until anonymous donations began arriving approximately 18 months before Alexandra's murder. The same time frame as the suspicious transfers from Marshall Crawford's accounts. When detectives arrived at the Renewal Foundation's modest offices in Brooklyn, they found James Whitman leading a support group for recently released individuals. His reaction to the news of Alexandra's death was captured by the body cameras worn by the officers, genuine shock followed by profound grief. "I hadn't spoken to Alex in over 8 years," Whitman told investigators during his initial interview. "Not since the day she told me she was seeing Marshall Crawford. As for these donations, yes, they saved our foundation, but I had no idea they came from her. They were processed through an attorney's office in Delaware, completely anonymous. Forensic examination of Alexandra's personal devices revealed a carefully hidden email account under the name Allie Parker, her nickname and maiden name, which she had used to communicate with the Delaware law firm handling the anonymous donations. The emails painted a picture of a woman torn between her present and her past. "I need to make these transfers more carefully going forward," she wrote 3 months before her death. "M is becoming suspicious about discrepancies in the accounts. He mentioned hiring a new financial team to review everything. We need to pause for a while until things cool down." What was most striking to investigators was the lack of direct communication between Alexandra and James. If she was secretly funneling millions to his foundation, why was there no evidence they had reconnected? According to all electronic records, phone logs, and witness statements, they had maintained absolute separation since her relationship with Marshall began. The case took another turn when investigators interviewed Madison Wells, Alexandra's personal assistant, for the past 4 years. Initially hesitant to speak about her employer, Madison eventually revealed that Alexandra had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to her death. "She asked me to book her a hotel room in Brooklyn using my personal credit card, not the company card she normally had me use for everything," Madison explained. "She stayed there for one night about 2 weeks before she died. She made me promise not to tell anyone, especially not Mr. Crawford. She said it was for a surprise she was planning." Hotel security footage from that night showed Alexandra meeting with a man in the hotel restaurant, Not James Whitman, but Dean Reynolds, the Renewal Foundation's chief financial officer and James's right-hand man. The conversation appeared intense, with Alexandra repeatedly shaking her head and at one point appearing to wipe away tears. When confronted with this footage, Reynolds admitted to the meeting but insisted it was innocent. She wanted updates on how her donations were being used. She was proud of what we were accomplishing, but terrified her husband would discover what she was doing. She believed he would never understand her supporting James's work. Given their history, that history, as detectives would discover, was far more complicated than a simple divorce. Court records sealed at the request of both parties contained troubling allegations. During their marriage, James had been arrested following a physical altercation with a colleague. Although charges were eventually dropped, the incident led to his firing from his prestigious law firm. Alexandra had stood by him through the legal proceedings, but filed for divorce shortly after the case was dismissed. James had anger issues, revealed Thomas Parker, Alexandra's brother. He never hurt Alex, at least not physically, but she was afraid of what he might do. The night of the incident that got him arrested, she called me in tears, saying she didn't recognize the man she'd married anymore. The divorce was her escape. This revelation cast a new light on James Whitman's spiritual transformation and dedication to rehabilitation work. Was it genuine redemption or an elaborate facade? Meanwhile, Marshall Crawford's perfect alibi began to show cracks not in its validity, but in what it represented. Several business associates confirmed that the Tokyo trip had been arranged unexpectedly, with Crawford insisting on handling negotiations personally, despite typically sending his executive team for such matters. He was adamant about going himself, his executive assistant told investigators. He rearranged his entire schedule, cancelled several important meetings here in New York. It was unusual but not unheard of. Mr. Crawford can be impulsive when it comes to business decisions. Had Marshall somehow discovered his wife's betrayal? Had he orchestrated her murder from thousands of miles away, creating an airtight alibi for himself in the process? As the first month of the investigation concluded, 3 key suspects emerged, each with their own motives for wanting Alexandra Crawford dead. Marshall Crawford, the betrayed husband who might have discovered his wife was secretly giving millions to her ex-husband's cause. James Whitman, the ex-husband with a history of anger issues, whose foundation stood to lose everything if the donations stopped. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And a third, unexpected suspect, Diane Crawford, Marshall's daughter from his first marriage, whose inheritance would be significantly impacted by Alexandra's control over her father's fortune. But, as Detective Rodriguez repeatedly reminded her team, motives don't kill people. People kill people. And somewhere in this web of money, secrets, and lies is the truth about who ended Alexandra Crawford's life. What no one realized yet was that the most damning evidence was still to be discovered, hidden in plain sight. All along, the investigation into Alexandra Crawford's murder took a dramatic turn 6 weeks after her death, when a groundskeeper at the Southampton estate made a startling discovery. While replacing a damaged sprinkler head near the property's garden maze, he unearthed a waterproof bag containing a journal and USB drive that had been carefully buried beneath a rosebush. Alexandra's favorite flowers, planted by her own hands the previous spring. It was pure chance, Detective Rodriguez later explained. If that particular sprinkler hadn't malfunctioned, we might never have found it. The journal contained entries dating back 3 years, written in Alexandra's distinctive handwriting. The most recent entry was dated just 2 days before her murder. "I'm running out of options. The walls are closing in. Marshall's new financial team has scheduled a complete audit of all accounts for next month. Dean says we need to move quickly if we're going to secure the final transfer. I never thought it would come to this, having to choose between my past and my future. But some debts can never truly be repaid, no matter how much money you throw at them. The USB drive contained something even more valuable to investigators, a video file. Alexandra had recorded herself sitting in what appeared to be a hotel room, later identified as the Brooklyn Hotel, where she had met Dean Reynolds. "If you're watching this, something has happened to me," she began, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I need to explain why I've been secretly transferring money to the Renewal Foundation. It's not what anyone thinks." The video confession ran for 27 minutes. In it, Alexandra revealed a truth that had remained hidden for over a decade. A truth that redefined everyone's understanding of her relationship with both Marshall Crawford and James Whitman. During their marriage, James and Alexandra had been involved in a fatal car accident. After a night of argument and heavy drinking, James had insisted on driving them home from a friend's party. Their car struck a homeless man on a deserted street. The man died instantly. James was still on probation from his previous assault. "In charge," Alexandra explained in the video. "He panicked, said his career would be over if this came out. He made me promise to say I was driving." Alexandra, believing she was protecting the man she loved, agreed to take the blame. The incident was ruled an accident, with no charges filed against her, but the guilt consumed her, contributing to the breakdown of their marriage. "When I met Marshall years later, I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth," she continued. "How do you tell someone you love that you've been complicit in covering up a death? That you let an innocent man's family believe their father died in an accident caused by you, not your husband?" The true purpose of Alexandra's donations became clear. Not support for her ex-husband, but atonement. The Renewal Foundation had established a special program specifically supporting homeless individuals and families of victims of drunk driving incidents. "The money isn't for James. It never was," Alexandra insisted, tears streaming down her face. "It's for the people like the man we killed that night, people whose names we never even knew." But the most shocking revelation came in the final minutes of the video. Alexandra revealed that she had recently discovered Marshall had known about the accident all along. She had found documents in his private safe indicating he had hired private investigators to research her past before they married. "He's known from the beginning, everything. The accident, my lie to protect James, all of it. He never said a word." Alexandra's voice cracked with emotion. "And now I've discovered something worse. Marshall didn't just know about my past. He's been using it." According to Alexandra's testimony, Marshall had been quietly leveraging his knowledge of the accident to pressure James Whitman on various business matters over the years. The Renewal Foundation owned valuable real estate in Brooklyn, property that stood in the way of a major development project backed by Crawford Investments. "If Marshall finds out I've been sending money to the foundation, he'll see it as a betrayal," Alexandra explained. "Not because I kept it secret, but because I've been strengthening James's position. The foundation is the only thing keeping James from having to sell that property to Marshall's development group." The video ended with Alexandra looking directly into the camera. "I don't know what's going to happen next. I've arranged to meet with James directly for the first time in years. He deserves to know the truth, that Marshall has been using our past against him, and that I've been trying to make amends in the only way I knew how." That meeting was scheduled for the evening of June 16th, the night Alexandra was murdered. Armed with this new information, Detective Rodriguez brought James Whitman in for another round of questioning. His reaction to the video was visceral: shock, grief, and then rage. "She was going to tell the truth after all these years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what that would have meant? Everything I've built, all the good we've done at the foundation, it could have been destroyed. When pressed about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, Whitman's alibi remained intact. He had been leading an overnight retreat for Foundation staff and program participants at a campsite in the Catskills. 27 people verified. His presence from early evening until breakfast the following morning. "I never met with Alexandra," he insisted. "She never showed up to our meeting. I waited for an hour at the coffee shop we had agreed on, then assumed she had changed her mind. I went straight to the retreat from there. Security footage from the coffee shop confirmed his account. Alexandra had never arrived for their scheduled meeting. The investigation shifted to Marshall Crawford and the revelation that he had known about the accident all along. When confronted with the evidence, Marshall's carefully constructed facade of grief crumbled. "Of course I investigated her before we married," he admitted, his tone suddenly cold. "I don't build a multi-billion-dollar empire by being careless. I know everything about everyone in my life." But he vehemently denied using the information to pressure Whitman, or having any knowledge of Alexandra's secret donations. "If I had known she was funneling my money to her ex-husband, I would have confronted her directly. Why would I have her killed? I could have simply divorced her. The prenuptial agreement would have left her with virtually nothing." The prenuptial agreement, obtained by subpoena, confirmed Crawford's claim. In the event of divorce, Alexandra would receive only a fixed settlement of $5 million, a pittance compared to Crawford's estimated $4.8 billion net worth and less than the amount she had already secretly donated to the Renewal Foundation. Financial experts brought in by the investigation team pointed out that the manner in which Alexandra had structured the donations suggested she was familiar with ways to move money undetected, knowledge unusual for someone with her background as a former elementary school teacher. "These transactions show a sophisticated understanding of financial systems," noted Samantha Wright, a forensic accountant consulting on the case. "The routing through multiple shell companies, the timing of transfers to avoid detection, this isn't amateur work. Either Mrs. Crawford had extensive help, or she had skills no one knew about." That observation led investigators to dig deeper into Alexandra's past before her marriage to James Whitman. What they discovered was yet another layer of deception. Alexandra Parker had briefly worked for a financial intelligence unit of the Treasury Department after college, before changing careers to become a teacher. This detail had been omitted from all her public biographies and social media profiles. She had the training to move this money herself, Detective Rodriguez concluded. The question is, why hide that part of her background? It's not incriminating or embarrassing. The answer emerged when investigators interviewed Alexandra's former supervisor at the Treasury Department, who had since retired. "Alexandra was brilliant at tracking money laundering operations," explained Robert Mercer, her former boss. "She had an instinct for following the money. That's what made what happened so unfortunate." According to Mercer, Alexandra had been working on an investigation into offshore accounts linked to several prominent New York real estate developers. The investigation was abruptly shut down by higher authorities, and Alexandra was transferred to a different department. Frustrated by what she saw as political interference, she resigned shortly after and pursued teaching instead. Among the developers being investigated, a younger, still-rising Marshall Crawford, whose early real estate ventures had preceded his technology empire. "I doubt she made the connection when they met years later," Mercer speculated. "Crawford wasn't as well known then, and he operated through so many shell companies that even we had trouble linking everything back to him. But if she ever realized who he was..." This revelation suggested a disturbing possibility. Had Alexandra discovered that her husband was the same man whose suspicious financial activities she had investigated years earlier? Was her marriage itself built on a foundation of lies? The investigation took another turn when Dean Reynolds, the Renewal Foundation's CFO, who had met with Alexandra in Brooklyn, was found dead in his apartment from an apparent suicide. A note found at the scene read simply, "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I was just following orders." Forensic analysis of Reynolds's phone and computer revealed encrypted communications with an unknown party using the username Sentinel. The messages discussed keeping AC in check and making sure the donations continue without complications. When investigators managed to trace the IP address associated with Sentinel, it led not to Marshall Crawford or James Whitman, but to a surprising third location, the home office of Diane Crawford, Marshall's daughter from his first marriage. Diane Crawford, 32, had always maintained a low public profile, despite her position as Crawford Tech's chief strategy officer. Described by colleagues as brilliant but cold, she had been the only family member to openly oppose her father's marriage to Alexandra. Diane never tried to hide her contempt for Alexandra, recalled Jennifer Lawson, Marshall Crawford's executive assistant. She called her a gold digger to her face at the company Christmas party their first year of marriage. Mr. Crawford had to physically separate them. When confronted with the evidence of her communication with Reynolds, Diane initially denied everything, but faced with the possibility of obstruction of justice charges, she eventually revealed a partial truth. "Yes, I was in contact with Reynolds," she admitted through her attorney. "I was concerned about these massive donations leaving my father's accounts. As CSO of the company, it's my job to protect our assets. I asked Reynolds to keep me informed about Alexandra's activities, but I never ordered anyone's death, not Alexandra's, and certainly not Reynolds." The timestamp on Reynolds' final message to Sentinel was 11:42 p.m. on June 16th, approximately 1 hour before the estimated time of Alexandra's murder based on forensic evidence. The message read, "Meeting cancelled. She never showed. Moving to the contingency plan as discussed." This timeline suggested that Reynolds had been expecting Alexandra to meet with James Whitman, had been monitoring the situation, and had reported back to Diane when the meeting didn't occur. But if Alexandra hadn't met with Whitman as planned, where had she gone instead? And what was the contingency plan referenced in Reynolds' message? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Greta Martinez, the Crawfords' housekeeper who had discovered Alexandra's body. During a follow-up interview, she recalled something she had initially forgotten in the trauma of finding her employer dead. "When I arrived that morning, there was a car I didn't recognize parked down the street," she told Detective Rodriguez. "A black SUV with tinted windows. I remember thinking it was strange because Mrs. Crawford wasn't expecting any visitors while Mr. Crawford was away." Security camera footage from neighboring properties confirmed Greta's observation. A black Cadillac Escalade had parked approximately 200 yards from the Crawford estate at 10:37 p.m. on June 16th and departed at 2:14 a.m. on June 17th, just hours before Alexandra's body was discovered. The vehicle was registered to a private security firm, Sentinel Strategic Solutions. "The name can't be a coincidence," Detective Rodriguez noted. "Someone using the username Sentinel was communicating with Reynolds, and now we have a company with the same name connected to the crime scene." Investigation into Sentinel Strategic Solutions revealed it was a boutique security firm that specialized in problem resolution for high-net-worth individuals. The company had been founded 7 years earlier by former military and intelligence operatives. Its client list was heavily protected, but a forensic audit of Crawford Tech's expenses revealed regular payments to the firm classified as executive protection services. When investigators arrived at Sentinel's offices with a search warrant, they found the premises had been vacated just hours earlier. Digital storage devices had been wiped clean and physical files removed. The only employee present was a receptionist who claimed to have been hired through a temp agency the previous week. The investigation hit a wall until a package arrived at the Southampton Police Department addressed to Detective Rodriguez. It contained a single USB drive with a video file, security footage from inside the Crawford estate on the night of the murder. The footage showed Alexandra in her study at 11:15 p.m., pacing anxiously while on her phone. At 11:32 p.m., she opened the French doors to the patio and stepped outside, still on her phone. There she was met by a man whose face remained hidden from the camera's angle. They appeared to argue. At 11:47 p.m., the man struck Alexandra with what appeared to be the crystal award, later identified as the murder weapon. The footage ended abruptly after showing the man standing over Alexandra's body. Though the killer's face wasn't visible, his build and movements were distinctive and familiar to anyone who had spent time reviewing footage of the investigation's suspects. An analysis of cell tower data placed Diane Crawford's phone within a half-mile of the estate at the time of the murder, despite her previous claims that she had been at home in Manhattan all evening. When confronted with this evidence, Diane's composed exterior finally cracked. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she whispered, her attorney immediately attempting to stop the interview. "It was just supposed to be a conversation, to make her understand that she needed to stop interfering with my father's business. Reynolds said she was going to meet with James that night, but when she cancelled, I thought I could reason with her directly." According to Diane's eventual confession, she had originally hired Sentinel Strategic Solutions to monitor Alexandra's activities after noticing discrepancies in company and family accounts. When she discovered the donations to the Renewal Foundation, she believed Alexandra was working with her ex-husband to undermine Crawford's business interests, specifically to prevent him from acquiring the valuable Brooklyn property. "My father built everything from nothing, and she was giving it away to her ex-husband," Diane said during her formal confession. "I confronted her that night, showed her the evidence I had gathered. I expected her to be defensive, to lie. Instead, she laughed." According to Diane, Alexandra revealed she had recently discovered the connection between her Treasury Department investigation years ago and Marshall Crawford. She had been gathering evidence of ongoing financial improprieties within Crawford Tech, evidence she planned to take public. "She said she had been blind for years, but finally saw my father for who he really was," Diane continued. "She said she was going to bring everything crashing down. The company, our family name, all of it. That the money she'd given to the Renewal Foundation was just the beginning of her atonement." The confrontation escalated when Alexandra revealed she had documented everything in files that would be automatically sent to authorities if anything happened to her. "Something just snapped inside me," Diane admitted. "The award was sitting there on her desk. I grabbed it without thinking. After she fell, I realized what I'd done. I panicked and called my contact at Sentinel. They helped me clean up, make it look like a break-in gone wrong." The case against Diane Crawford seemed airtight, until her father made an unexpected move. In a private meeting with the district attorney, Marshall Crawford provided evidence that he claimed exonerated his daughter. Security footage from Crawford Tech's offices showed Diane in a late-night meeting at the exact time of Alexandra's murder, seemingly contradicting both the cell tower data and Diane's own confession. "My daughter is protecting me," Marshall stated through tears. "I was the one at the estate that night. I flew back from Tokyo secretly because I had discovered Alexandra's betrayal. The company jet records were altered to make it appear I was still in Japan. Diane found out what I'd done and tried to take the blame." When presented with her father's statement, Diane refused to change her confession. "He's lying to protect me. Check the flight manifests more carefully. He never left Tokyo. The investigation had reached a stalemate, a daughter and father each claiming responsibility for the same crime. with contradictory evidence supporting and refuting both versions. The truth would finally emerge from an unexpected source, Alexandra herself. The files she had mentioned to Diane that would be automatically sent if anything happened to her turned out to be real. Exactly 3 months after her murder, dozens of financial journalists, law enforcement agencies, and regulatory bodies simultaneously received encrypted files containing years of documentation on Crawford Tech's financial activities. The automated system, set up by Alexandra using her Treasury Department training, had been programmed to release the information after 90 days if she didn't enter a specific code to stop it. The documents revealed a stunning truth. Both Marshall and Diane Crawford had been at the Southampton estate the night of the murder. They had arrived separately, unaware of each other's presence, both intending to confront Alexandra about different aspects of her activities. Security camera footage that neither was aware of, installed by Alexandra herself, showed the full sequence of events. Diane had indeed struck Alexandra in anger during their confrontation on the patio. Minutes later, believing Alexandra was merely unconscious, Diane had called her sentinel contact for help and left the scene. But Alexandra was still alive. Marshall, who had secretly returned from Tokyo and was waiting nearby for Diane to leave, then approached his injured wife. The footage, with clear audio, captured their final conversation. "I know everything, Marshall," Alexandra gasped, blood pooling beneath her head, "about your past, about what you've been doing all these years. The same crimes I investigated before we even met." "You should have left it alone, Alex," Marshall replied calmly. "We could have had everything." "I've made arrangements," she warned him. "All the evidence, everything I've gathered. It goes public if I don't stop it." "Then I'll have to find it and stop it myself," Marshall said. He picked up the same award his daughter had used and struck Alexandra again, the blow that forensics would later determine was the actual cause of death. The final piece of evidence was a recorded phone call between Marshall and Diane later that night, in which he assured her that he had taken care of the Alexandra situation and that she should establish an alibi immediately. Armed with this evidence, prosecutors charged both Crawfords with Alexandra's murder, Marshall with first-degree murder and Diane with second-degree murder and conspiracy. In a twist that stunned New York society, James Whitman provided key testimony for the prosecution, revealing how Marshall had been pressuring him for years over the Brooklyn property using knowledge of the old accident as leverage. The Crawford trial became one of the most sensational cases in New York history, a tale of wealth, power, secrets, and ultimately justice long delayed but finally served. And the Renewal Foundation. It received one final donation from Alexandra Crawford, the entirety of her $5 million divorce settlement, which under New York law she was still entitled to despite her death occurring before any divorce proceedings began. The money was used to establish a permanent program in her name, dedicated to supporting victims of financial crimes and corporate malfeasance, a fitting legacy for a woman who had spent her final years seeking redemption for the sins of her past while exposing the crimes of the present. The trial of Marshall and Diane Crawford began on a rain-soaked Monday in April 2024, nearly 10 months after Alexandra's murder. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters from around the world, all eager to document what had been dubbed the trial of the decade by the New York media. Inside courtroom 4B of the Suffolk County Supreme Court building, District Attorney Eleanor Bennett prepared to deliver her opening statement. At 58, Bennett had prosecuted some of New York's most notorious criminals, but even she admitted this case was different. "The defendants before you today aren't just accused of murder," she told the jury, gesturing toward Marshall and Diane Crawford. who sat at separate tables with their respective defense teams. They're accused of believing that their wealth and power placed them above the law, above basic human decency, that their money could buy them not just luxury, but impunity. The father and daughter had not spoken to each other since their arrests 5 months earlier. Marshall's defense strategy centered on claiming sole responsibility, insisting that Diane was innocent and had falsely confessed to protect him. Diane's attorneys argued the opposite, that she had acted alone in a moment of passion and that her father was attempting to shield her from the consequences. What we have here is a tragic case of misplaced loyalty, Marshall's attorney, Victor Harmon, countered in his opening statement. Mr. Crawford is willing to sacrifice everything, his freedom, his reputation, his legacy, to protect his daughter. The prosecution's theory that they acted together is a convenient narrative that ignores the complicated reality of this family's dynamics. The prosecution's case began with forensic evidence. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the medical examiner who performed Alexandra's autopsy, testified that she had suffered 2 distinct attacks. The victim sustained an initial blunt force trauma to the back of the head, which would have rendered her unconscious but was not immediately fatal, Dr. Vasquez explained, referring to enlarged photographs that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. A second, more severe impact to the temporal region occurred approximately 15 to 20 minutes later, based on the different stages of clotting observed. This second impact caused the fatal brain hemorrhage. This testimony supported the prosecution's timeline. Diane had attacked Alexandra first, then Marshall had delivered the killing blow after his daughter had fled the scene. The surveillance, footage from Alexandra's hidden security system, was played in court on day 3 of the trial. The quality was surprisingly clear. Alexandra had spared no expense on the system she had installed without her husband's knowledge. The footage showed Diane arriving at 11:28 p.m., entering through the garden gate rather than the main entrance. Alexandra met her on the patio, initially calm, but growing visibly agitated as their conversation progressed. At 11:47 p.m., Diane grabbed the crystal award from a nearby table and struck Alexandra, who collapsed onto the stone patio. Panicked, Diane made a phone call before fleeing at 11:53 p.m. At 12:16 a.m., Marshall appeared on the same patio, approaching Alexandra's still form, cautiously. The audio captured their final exchange before Marshall delivered the second, fatal blow at 12:21 a.m. The courtroom fell silent as the footage ended. Even the most seasoned journalists looked shaken. One juror requested a break, which Judge William Donovan granted. When proceedings resumed, the prosecution called their key witness, James Whitman. Whitman entered the courtroom dressed simply in a navy suit, his face solemn. As he passed the defense tables, he briefly made eye contact with Marshall Crawford, whose expression remained impassive. "Mr. Whitman," D.A. Bennett began, "please tell the court about your relationship with Alexandra Crawford." Over the next 3 hours, Whitman detailed his history with Alexandra, their marriage, the fatal accident, her taking the blame, their subsequent divorce, and years of silence between them. "Alexandra contacted me for the first time in 8 years last spring," he testified. "She said she had been anonymously supporting the foundation for over a year, but felt it was time to meet in person. She mentioned discovering something about her husband that had changed everything for her." "And did that meeting ever take place?" Bennett asked. "No," Whitman replied. "She never showed up. I later learned she had been murdered that night." When asked about Marshall Crawford's attempts to acquire the Brooklyn property owned by the Renewal Foundation, Whitman's testimony became particularly damning. At first, the offers seemed legitimate, just business, but over time the pressure intensified, Whitman explained. Crawford's representatives began hinting that they knew about my past, specifically about the accident Alexandra had taken the blame for. The message was clear: sell to Crawford or risk having the truth exposed. "Did you ever confront Mr. Crawford about these threats?" Bennett asked. "Once," Whitman confirmed. "At a charity gala about 2 years ago. He pulled me aside and said, 'I know what really happened that night, James. Your whole redemption story is built on a lie. It would be a shame if your supporters found out.'" He didn't need to elaborate further. The cross-examination by Marshall's attorney attempted to paint Whitman as a man with his own motives for revenge against the Crawfords. "Isn't it true that your foundation was financially dependent on these anonymous donations that turned out to be from Alexandra?" Harmon challenged. "We were grateful for her support, but we weren't dependent on it," Whitman countered. "The foundation was operating successfully before her donations began. And you expect this jury to believe you had no idea the money was coming from her?" Harmon pressed. "I had no idea," Whitman insisted. "Alexandra was careful to route everything through multiple channels. I only learned the truth after her death." The prosecution's next witness brought gasps from the gallery. Madison Wells, Alexandra's former personal assistant, who had not been publicly connected to the case until that moment. "Alexandra gave me a sealed envelope about a month before she died," Madison testified, her voice barely audible at first. "She said if anything ever happened to her, I should wait exactly 30 days and then deliver it to this address." She pointed to an evidence bag containing the envelope in question. "And what was in this envelope, Ms. Wells?" Bennett asked. "A key to a safety deposit box and instructions," Madison replied. "I followed those instructions after she was killed." The box contained a hard drive with copies of all the financial records she had been collecting, along with a letter explaining what she had discovered about Crawford Tech's operations. According to Madison's testimony, Alexandra had uncovered evidence that Crawford Tech's meteoric rise wasn't solely due to innovative technology. The company had engaged in corporate espionage, stolen intellectual property from competitors, and used offshore accounts to evade taxes and launder money from questionable contracts with authoritarian regimes. "She told me she felt trapped," Madison continued. "She had built a life with a man whose fortune was tainted. When she tried to make amends by donating to worthy causes like the Renewal Foundation, she discovered her husband had been using her past against her ex-husband. It was like waking up to find yourself in quicksand." The defense teams for both Crawfords attempted to have Madison's testimony stricken from the record, arguing it was hearsay and prejudicial. Judge Donovan allowed most of it to stand, ruling that Alexandra's statements to Madison qualified as dying declarations. A dramatic moment came during week 3 of the trial when the prosecution called Robert Chen, a former Sentinel Strategic Solutions operative who had been granted immunity, in exchange for his testimony. "I was the emergency response specialist dispatched to the Crawford estate that night," Chen testified. "Ms. Crawford called our emergency line at 11:54 p.m., saying there had been an incident requiring immediate cleanup and discretion." "And what did you find when you arrived?" Bennett asked. "I never made it inside the property," Chen replied. "I was instructed to wait down the street for further instructions. At approximately 12:30 a.m., I received a text message saying the situation had been handled differently and that I should return to headquarters immediately." "Who sent that text message, Mr. Chen?" "Marshall Crawford," Chen answered. "He had override authority on all Sentinel operations related to his family's security." This testimony directly contradicted Marshall's claim that he had been in Tokyo when the murder occurred. Flight records subsequently introduced into evidence showed that a private jet registered to a subsidiary of Crawford Tech had indeed made an unscheduled flight from Tokyo to a private airfield in New Jersey on June 16th. Returning to Japan the following morning, As the prosecution built its case, fractures began to appear in the united front the Crawford defense teams had initially presented. Diane's attorney, Rebecca Lloyd, began aggressively pushing the narrative that her client had acted in a moment of passion, but had never intended to kill Alexandra. Ms. Crawford discovered that her family's fortune was being secretly funneled to her father's business rival, Lloyd argued. She confronted Alexandra, things escalated, and a terrible accident occurred. But Diane Crawford left, believing Alexandra was injured, not dying. It was Marshall Crawford who made the calculated decision to end Alexandra's life. This strategy effectively threw Marshall under the bus, creating visible tension between the defendants. On day 17 of the trial, Marshall requested a meeting with the district attorney without his lawyers present, a highly unusual move that Judge Donovan reluctantly approved with strict oversight. What transpired in that meeting remained confidential, but when court reconvened the following morning, Marshall Crawford changed his plea to guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder. "I alone am responsible for Alexandra's death," he told the shocked courtroom before being led away. "My daughter acted in anger, but I acted with premeditation. The full weight of justice should fall on me alone." With Marshall's confession and guilty plea, the prosecution's case against Diane shifted. She was now tried solely for the initial assault and for conspiracy to cover up the crime. After 3 more days of testimony and 7 hours of jury deliberation, Diane Crawford was found guilty of second-degree assault and conspiracy to obstruct justice, but acquitted of murder charges. Marshall Crawford was sentenced to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. Diane received 12 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 8. The verdict sent shockwaves through New York's elite circles. The Crawford name, once synonymous with innovation and philanthropy, became associated with murder and corruption. Crawford Tech's stock plummeted, and the company's board quickly moved to distance itself from its founder, renaming the company and donating substantial sums to victims' advocacy groups. But the story of Alexandra Crawford's murder didn't end with the sentencing of her killers. The evidence she had meticulously gathered about Crawford Tech's illegal activities triggered multiple federal investigations. 6 months after the murder trial concluded, the Securities and Exchange Commission filed charges against 14 current and former Crawford Tech executives. The Department of Justice followed with its own indictments related to corporate espionage and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Alexandra's posthumous exposé accomplished what years of regulatory oversight had failed to do. It cracked open the secretive world of corporate malfeasance that had allowed Marshall Crawford's empire to flourish. The Renewal Foundation, now led by James Whitman with increased transparency and oversight, continued its work with former inmates and expanded its programs using Alexandra's final donation. The Brooklyn property that had been at the center of so much conflict was converted into a community center named in Alexandra's honor. Alexandra spent years trying to make amends for a mistake she didn't even commit, Whitman told reporters at the center's opening ceremony. In death, she's accomplished more than most of us do in a lifetime. She exposed corruption, brought down a criminal enterprise disguised as a tech company, and left a legacy that will help thousands of people rebuild their lives. The case took one final unexpected turn 18 months after the trial, when Greta Martinez, the housekeeper who had discovered Alexandra's body, published a memoir titled Behind Closed Doors, My Years with the Crawfords. The book became an instant bestseller, offering intimate glimpses into the dysfunctional family dynamics that had ultimately led to murder. According to Greta, the seeds of tragedy had been planted years earlier. She revealed that Marshall had married Alexandra, not for love, but because of her connection to James Whitman and the valuable Brooklyn property. He told me once, after too many scotches, that marrying Alexandra was the best business decision he ever made, Greta wrote. He said, "That property will be worth billions after rezoning. If I have to play the devoted husband for a few years to get it, that's just another investment." Greta's book also detailed the increasingly strained relationship between Alexandra and her stepdaughter Diane. They were more alike than either would admit, she observed. Both brilliant, both stubborn, both fiercely protective of Marshall in their own ways. If they hadn't been positioned as rivals from the beginning, they might have been allies. Perhaps most poignantly, Greta described the gradual change she had witnessed in Alexandra during her final year. She started asking questions about Marshall's business that she had never cared about before, Greta recalled. She spent hours in his home office when he was traveling. I thought perhaps she was just taking more interest in her husband's work, but now I understand. She was gathering evidence. She was building her case. 5 years after Alexandra Crawford's murder, a documentary filmmaker produced Blood Money, The Alexandra Crawford Case, featuring interviews with Detective Rodriguez, James Whitman, Madison Wells, and others connected to the investigation. The film won critical acclaim for its unflinching examination of how wealth and power can corrupt justice. In one of the documentary's most powerful moments, Thomas Parker, Alexandra's brother, reflected on his sister's legacy. While standing beside the community center that bore her name, Alex always felt guilty about the accident, even though it wasn't her fault, he said. She spent years trying to atone for someone else's sin. But in the end, she found a different kind of redemption. She used her position inside the Crawford empire to expose its rot from within. My sister died because she chose truth over comfort, justice over privilege, Parker continued. In her final acts, she showed more courage than most people demonstrate in a lifetime. She saw a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, and she refused to remain complicit in it. The community center established in Alexandra's name eventually expanded to multiple locations across New York, each one offering support services for victims of corporate crimes and educational programs focused on financial literacy and corporate accountability. The Alexandra Crawford Whistleblower Fund, established with assets seized from Crawford Tech during the federal investigation, provided financial support and legal protection for individuals coming forward with evidence of corporate wrongdoing. Within its first decade, the fund assisted whistleblowers whose testimony led to regulatory actions against 17 major corporations and the recovery of over $3 billion in illegally obtained funds. Marshall Crawford died in prison 7 years into his sentence, reportedly from complications related to heart disease. He never publicly expressed remorse for Alexandra's murder. Diane Crawford was released after serving 9 years and disappeared from public life, reportedly changing her name and relocating to the Pacific Northwest. James Whitman continued his work with the Renewal Foundation until his retirement at age 70, when he published his own memoir, The Long Road to Redemption. In it, he finally admitted the full truth about the accident that had shaped so many lives. "I wasn't just driving that night. I was driving recklessly, showing off, trying to prove something to Alexandra after our argument," he wrote. "When we hit that man, I panicked and begged her to say she was driving. It was the most selfish act of my life, and I've spent every day since trying to become worthy of the sacrifice she made. A sacrifice I never deserved." The final chapter of Whitman's book was devoted to Alexandra, whom he described as the bravest person I've ever known. "In the end, Alexandra chose truth over self-preservation," he wrote. "She could have continued living her privileged life, turning a blind eye to the corruption that funded it. Instead, she risked everything, and ultimately lost everything, because she believed that truth matters, that justice matters, that redemption is possible, but only if we're willing to face our sins honestly. Her story isn't just about a murder in the Hamptons or a billionaire's fall from grace, Whitman concluded. It's about the courage to confront our own complicity in systems that cause harm. Alexandra died because she refused to look away any longer. The question for all of us is, what are we willing to risk to live by the same principle? 20 years after her death, Alexandra Crawford's name no longer evoked tabloid headlines about murder among the elite. Instead, it had become synonymous with courage, redemption, and the pursuit of justice against seemingly insurmountable odds, a legacy far more valuable than all the billions that had surrounded her in life. 25 years after Alexandra Crawford's murder, on a rain-soaked evening in June 2048, an elderly man walked with difficulty into the Manhattan offices of the New York Herald. Despite his advanced age and the late hour, he insisted on speaking directly with Sophia Chen, the paper's chief investigative reporter. "I've been carrying this burden for too long," he told Chen, once they were alone in a conference room. "Before I die, I need to tell the truth about what really happened with the Crawford case." The man introduced himself as Edward Phelps, former Chief Legal Counsel for Sentinel Strategic Solutions. Now 87 and diagnosed with terminal cancer, Phelps claimed to have information that would rewrite the final chapter of one of New York's most notorious murders. "Everyone thinks they know the story," Phelps began, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a worn leather briefcase on the table. "Marshall and Diane Crawford killed Alexandra over money and secrets. Case closed. But that's not the whole truth. Not even close." Chen, who had built her career on exposing corporate corruption, listened skeptically at first. The Crawford case was considered definitively solved, the stuff of history books and true crime documentaries. What could possibly remain hidden after 25 years of intense scrutiny? But as Phelps began sharing documentation from his briefcase, internal Sentinel memos, encrypted communications, and financial records never presented in court, Chen realized she was being handed what every journalist dreams of: the story behind the story. According to Phelps, Sentinel Strategic Solutions had never been merely a security firm for high-net-worth individuals. It had originated as a specialized unit within a private military contractor before being spun off as a separate entity with a very specific clientele: ultra-wealthy individuals who needed problems permanently resolved without any connection to themselves. "We operated in the shadows between legal protection services and something darker," Phelps explained. Sentinel had two divisions: the public-facing security operation that provided legitimate services, and what we called the resolution team that handled situations requiring more permanent interventions. The most shocking revelation: Marshall Crawford had not been merely a client of Sentinel, he had been one of its founding investors, operating through multiple shell companies to hide his connection to the firm. Crawford essentially created a private intelligence and enforcement arm for himself and select associates, Phelps continued, a team of former military and intelligence operatives who could act outside normal legal constraints while maintaining plausible deniability for their employers. This connection explained how Marshall had been able to gather extensive information on Alexandra's past before their marriage, and how he had leveraged similar intelligence to pressure James Whitman regarding the Brooklyn property. But the true bombshell came next. Marshall Crawford had not been in Tokyo when Alexandra was murdered, nor had he secretly flown back to the Hamptons. According to Phelps, he had been in Washington, D.C., meeting with government officials about a classified cybersecurity contract. "Marshall didn't kill Alexandra," Phelps stated flatly. "He ordered it done, which is why he ultimately pleaded guilty. But he wasn't physically present that night. The actual killer, according to Sentinel's internal records, had been a resolution team operative codenamed Harbinger, a former Special Forces soldier trained in making assassinations look like accidents or crimes of passion. The plan was for Harbinger to stage a break-in gone wrong, Phelps explained. But things got complicated when Diane showed up unexpectedly and attacked Alexandra first. Harbinger had to adapt, waiting until Diane left before completing the mission. The surveillance footage that had been so crucial to the prosecution's case had been subtly altered, according to Phelps. The man seen delivering the final blow to Alexandra wasn't Marshall Crawford, but the Harbinger operative wearing a custom silicone mask designed to match Crawford's appearance, a contingency plan in case any security cameras captured the event. The technology was cutting edge at the time, Phelps noted. Good enough to fool security cameras, especially with the right camera angles and lighting conditions. We had an expert who could make subtle alterations to digital footage, removing any telltale signs of the mask. Even more disturbing, Marshall's confession and guilty plea had been a strategic decision, not an admission of physical guilt. By confessing to personally killing Alexandra, he prevented a deeper investigation that might have exposed Sentinel's operations and implicated dozens of other wealthy clients. Marshall took the fall because he knew he'd be found guilty of conspiracy. Anyway, Phelps said, by pleading guilty and claiming he acted alone, he protected Sentinel, his other business interests, and ironically, even Diane. His legal team had calculated that his age and health issues meant he'd likely die in prison, before serving his full sentence anyway. Chen spent weeks verifying Phelps's claims, cross-referencing his documents with publicly available records, and reaching out to surviving figures from the case. Most refused to comment, but a few provided cautious corroboration of specific details. The story she eventually published, the Sentinel Files, the hidden truth behind the Crawford murder, reignited public interest in the case and prompted the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office to establish a cold case review team. This new investigation confirmed many of Phelps's claims about Sentinel's true nature and Marshall Crawford's financial ties to the organization. Flight records and Secret Service logs verified Crawford's presence in Washington on the night of the murder, contradicting trial testimony. Most significantly, forensic experts using advanced technology unavailable in 2023 analyzed the original surveillance footage and confirmed it had been subtly altered. Enhancement of previously indistinct reflections in the patio doors showed discrepancies in the facial features of the man presumed to be Marshall Crawford. The New York Attorney General announced the opening of a grand jury investigation into potential obstruction of justice and prosecutorial misconduct related to the original case. Several former Sentinel employees were granted immunity in exchange for testimony. The most startling development came when authorities identified Harbinger as former Marine Corps officer Wesley Lambert, who had ostensibly died in a boating accident in 2025, 2 years after Alexandra's murder. His body had never been recovered. International law enforcement bulletins were issued, but Lambert remained at large, reportedly living under an assumed identity in Southeast Asia. Detective Vanessa Rodriguez, now retired and in her 70s, granted a rare interview about the case that had defined her career. "We followed the evidence we had," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "But looking back, there were inconsistencies we should have questioned more thoroughly. The resources and influence the Crawfords wielded created a kind of gravitational pull on the investigation, subtle pressures to accept the most straightforward narrative. The revelation about Sentinel's true nature and its connections to Marshall Crawford opened a Pandora's box of questions about other high-profile cases. Journalists and law enforcement began re-examining mysterious deaths, convenient accidents, and abrupt disappearances involving wealthy individuals with potential ties to the organization. The subsequent investigations revealed a network of corruption extending far beyond the Crawford case. Sentinel had operated for nearly 2 decades, serving clients from the highest echelons of finance, technology, and politics. Their services ranged from sophisticated surveillance and blackmail to arranged accidents and staged suicides for those who threatened their clients' interests. As the full scope of Sentinel's operations came to light, attention turned to the fate of Diane Crawford, who had been released from prison 15 years earlier after serving her sentence for assault and conspiracy. Journalists tracked her to a small coastal town in Oregon, where she had been living under the name Diane Fisher, working as a grant writer for environmental non-profits. Initially refusing all interview requests, she finally agreed to speak with Sophia Chen for a follow-up to her groundbreaking article. "I've spent 15 years trying to atone for my part in what happened," Diane told Chen during their meeting at a local coffee shop. "Not just for hitting Alexandra that night, but for all the years I enabled my father's corruption by looking the other way." According to Diane, she had genuinely believed her father was in Tokyo the night of the murder. When she fled the estate after attacking Alexandra, she had called her Sentinel contact in a panic, unaware that she was setting in motion a contingency plan already established by her father. "I thought I was protecting the family business from scandal," she explained. "I never imagined I was giving them the opportunity to commit murder. When I found out later what had really happened, I wanted to come forward, but my father convinced me it would only make things worse. He said you handle it." When asked if she knew about Sentinel's true nature and her father's role in founding it, Diane's expression hardened. "Not until the trial was underway," she replied. "By then, I was already facing charges myself, and coming forward with that information would have implicated me further. I'm not proud of staying silent, but I was terrified." Diane revealed that her father had visited her in prison once after his own conviction, making a final request. "He told me to let it all die with him," she recalled. "To start a new life when I got out and never look back. I honored that request until now, but with everything coming to light about Sentinel, continuing to hide the truth feels like another crime." The final twist in the Alexandra Crawford saga emerged when Sophia Chen's investigation unearthed financial records suggesting that Alexandra's anonymous donations to the Renewal Foundation hadn't been her only secret philanthropic activity. She had also been quietly funding an organization called Digital Accountability Project, a non-profit dedicated to investigating corporate digital espionage and cybersecurity violations. The organization had been founded by Lily Zhang, a former Treasury Department colleague of Alexandra's who had worked with her on the abruptly terminated investigation into suspicious financial activities years earlier. The same investigation that had unknowingly targeted Marshall Crawford's early ventures. In an exclusive interview, Zhang revealed that Alexandra had reached out to her approximately 2 years before her death, after discovering the connection between her husband and the targets of their old investigation. She was devastated, Zhang recalled. She had unwittingly married a man whose financial crimes she had once been investigating. When she started noticing similar patterns in Crawford Tech's current operations, she contacted me to help document everything properly. According to Zhang, Alexandra had been gathering evidence not just for law enforcement, but also to support legislative efforts to close the loopholes that allowed companies like Crawford Tech to operate in legal gray areas. She wasn't just a whistleblower. She was trying to change the system, Zhang explained. She understood that putting Marshall in prison wouldn't solve the underlying problems if the legal framework that enabled his actions remained intact. The Digital Accountability Project had continued its work after Alexandra's death, operating in relative obscurity until the Sentinel revelations brought renewed attention to corporate accountability issues. The organization had been instrumental in drafting legislation that eventually became the Corporate Transparency and Accountability Act of 2030, which significantly strengthened penalties for corporate espionage and mandated greater disclosure of international business activities. In a society increasingly concerned about the unchecked power of tech billionaires, Alexandra Crawford was posthumously recast as a visionary who had recognized the dangers of allowing wealthy individuals to operate outside normal legal constraints. She saw what the rest of us missed, Lily Zhang noted during congressional testimony about corporate oversight. That the real threat wasn't just individual bad actors, but the emergence of a shadow legal system for the ultra-wealthy. A system where enough money could buy not just luxury, but impunity. The final chapter of the Crawford saga played out in the international manhunt for Wesley Lambert, the alleged Harbinger operative who had actually killed Alexandra. 3 years after Edward Phelps's revelations, Interpol agents tracked Lambert to a compound in northern Thailand. Rather than surrender, Lambert initiated a standoff that ended with the compound burning to the ground. Dental records confirmed his death in the fire, but rumors persisted that he had once again faked his demise. A memorial service marking the 30th anniversary of Alexandra's death was held at the community center bearing her name in Brooklyn. The attendees included James Whitman, now in his 80s and frail but determined to pay his respects, Thomas Parker, Alexandra's brother, Madison Wells, her former assistant, and surprisingly, Diane Crawford, making her first public appearance. In years, Alexandra's story seemed finished 25 years ago, Thomas Parker told the gathered crowd. We thought we knew what happened and why, but the truth, as my sister always insisted, has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. What we now understand is that Alexandra wasn't just the victim of a single act of violence, he continued. She was targeted because she threatened a system, a shadow network that protected the powerful from accountability. In challenging that system, she showed extraordinary courage. After the service, Diane approached James Whitman, their first meeting since the trial 3 decades earlier. Attendees described an emotional conversation between the two, ending with an embrace that suggested some measure of reconciliation had been achieved. When asked by journalists to comment on this moment, Whitman offered a perspective that perhaps best captured the complex legacy of the case. The Crawford case was never just about a murder in the Hamptons, he reflected. It was about power and its corrupting influence, about how wealth can create a separate reality where normal rules don't apply. Alexandra recognized that corruption and chose to stand against it, even at tremendous personal cost. The revelation about Sentinel only confirms what Alexandra understood before any of us, he continued, that the greatest threat to justice isn't individual criminals, but systems designed to place certain people beyond accountability. Her legacy isn't just the community centers or whistleblower funds bearing her name. It's the ongoing work of dismantling those systems of privilege and impunity. The story of Alexandra Crawford, teacher, whistleblower, and ultimately martyr, in the cause of corporate accountability, continues to resonate in a society grappling with the outsized influence of wealth and technology. Her journey from unwitting accomplice to courageous truth-teller serves as a powerful reminder that redemption often requires confronting not just individual wrongdoing, but the larger systems that enable it. As Sophia Chen wrote in the conclusion of her award-winning series on the case, Alexandra Crawford's true legacy may be in forcing us to confront an uncomfortable question. In a world where wealth can buy almost anything, including resolution services for inconvenient problems, what are we willing to sacrifice to ensure that justice remains something money cannot purchase? 30 years after her death, the answer to that question remains unresolved, But the conversation Alexandra started continues, her voice echoing through time in the ongoing struggle between accountability and impunity, between truth and power, between justice and wealth. The revelations about Sentinel's strategic solutions sent shockwaves through global financial markets. What had begun as an investigation into a decades-old murder had evolved into the exposure of a shadow organization serving the world's elite. An organization that had operated with impunity for nearly 30 years. By 2050, 2 years after, Edward Phelps's bombshell disclosures to journalist Sophia Chen, a joint task force comprising the FBI, SEC, and international law enforcement agencies, had identified over 70 former Sentinel operatives and nearly 200 clients spanning 15 countries. "What we're uncovering is unprecedented," said Special Agent Nathan Reeves, head of the FBI's Sentinel Investigation Task Force, during a Senate hearing. Sentinel wasn't merely a private security firm that occasionally crossed legal boundaries. It was a sophisticated organization designed specifically to allow ultra-wealthy individuals to circumvent laws that apply to everyone else. The investigation uncovered Sentinel's involvement in dozens of suspicious deaths, previously ruled accidents or suicides, corporate espionage operations that had destroyed competing businesses, blackmail schemes targeting politicians and regulators, and elaborate financial fraud that had diverted billions from public coffers. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting Sentinel's tactics had evolved over time from traditional intimidation to cutting-edge technological manipulation. Internal documents revealed the organization had pioneered the use of deepfakes, advanced surveillance systems, and artificial intelligence to discredit or destroy targets designated by their clients. Sentinel represents the logical endpoint of unchecked wealth concentration, testified Dr. Miranda Velasquez, a leading expert on economic inequality. When individuals amass resources exceeding those of entire nations, they inevitably seek to create systems that place them beyond accountability. As the investigation expanded, it reached far beyond Sentinel itself to examine the broader ecosystem that had enabled its operation. Investment banks that had facilitated financial transfers, law firms that had created Byzantine legal structures to hide ownership, and technology companies that had provided cutting-edge tools all came under scrutiny. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York announced indictments against 37 individuals directly connected to Sentinel operations, including former executives, field operatives, and several high-profile clients. But many key figures remained beyond the reach of American justice, protected by citizenship in countries without extradition treaties or by their immense resources. Among those indicted was Brian Lockhart, Marshall Crawford's longtime attorney, who had allegedly served as the primary liaison between Crawford and Sentinel. Lockhart's cooperation with prosecutors provided crucial insights into how the organization had operated and evolved after Crawford's imprisonment and death. Marshall Crawford envisioned Sentinel as his personal intelligence agency, Lockhart revealed during depositions, but after the Alexandra situation and his conviction, control shifted to a consortium of clients who saw the value in maintaining such a resource. They expanded its capabilities and client base while maintaining absolute secrecy. One surprising aspect of Lockhart's testimony concerned the existence of a secure database known as the Archive, a repository of compromising information on thousands of influential individuals collected over decades of Sentinel operations. This database had served both as an insurance policy against betrayal and as a powerful tool for manipulating political and regulatory decisions. The archive was Sentinel's most valuable asset, Lockhart explained, more valuable than any operational capability. It contained enough damaging information to destroy careers, marriages, and reputations across the highest levels of global society. The existence of the archive sparked a privacy crisis, as speculation ran rampant about what information it might contain and who might have accessed it. Politicians, celebrities, and business leaders who had never been publicly linked to Sentinel nonetheless began issuing preemptive denials of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, the investigation into Sentinel's role in Alexandra Crawford's murder continued to yield new insights. Forensic technologists analyzing the surveillance footage from the night of her death confirmed that sophisticated editing had been employed to alter certain physical characteristics of the killer while maintaining the overall appearance of Marshall Crawford. The technology used was remarkably advanced for 2023, noted Dr. Leila Patel, a forensic video analyst who consulted on the case. It's similar to techniques that wouldn't become commercially available for another 3 years. Sentinel had access to technological capabilities that were effectively state-level at the time. Perhaps the most significant development came when authorities located Meredith Reynolds, widow of Dean Reynolds, the Renewal Foundation CFO, who had allegedly committed suicide shortly after Alexandra's murder. Living under an assumed name in rural Canada, Reynolds revealed that her husband's death had been neither suicide nor accident. "Dean called me in a panic the night before he died," she testified. "He said Alexandra Crawford had been murdered and that he feared he might be next. He was planning to go to the police with information about communications he'd had with Diane Crawford and someone he referred to only as the ghost client." According to Meredith, Dean had been found dead in their apartment the next morning, the scene carefully staged to suggest suicide. The investigation at the time had accepted this conclusion without significant scrutiny. Another example, prosecutors now argued, of Sentinel's ability to influence official proceedings. Cell phone records recovered from Dean Reynolds' personal effects, preserved by his widow, revealed communications with a third party using sophisticated encryption. When decrypted using modern techniques, these messages indicated that Reynolds had been unknowingly communicating with Wesley Lambert, the Harbinger operative, who had posed as an anonymous whistleblower within Crawford Tech in order to gather intelligence on Alexandra's activities. Lambert effectively ran a counter-intelligence operation against Alexandra, explained cybersecurity expert Dr. Aaron Michaels. He manipulated Reynolds into providing information about her donations and movements, while posing as someone sympathetic to her concerns about Crawford's business practices. This revelation added a new dimension to the case. Alexandra's murder had not been merely a reaction to her discovery of her husband's corruption, but a carefully planned operation that had been in development for months as she got closer to uncovering the truth about Sentinel itself. Journal entries recovered from Alexandra's personal cloud storage, accessed through long-dormant accounts identified during the investigation, revealed that in the weeks before her death, she had begun connecting the dots between various suspicious incidents involving her husband's competitors and critics. "There's something beyond Crawford Tech that Marshall is involved with," she wrote 3 weeks before her murder. "Too many coincidences, too many sudden accidents befalling people who cross him. Lily thinks I'm being paranoid, but the pattern is unmistakable once you start looking for it." Another entry, dated just 5 days before her death, found references to something called Sentinel in files Marshall thought were secure. "When I searched for information, I found nothing, which itself feels suspicious. No company, no public footprint, yet recurring payments in the millions. What kind of legitimate business leaves no trace?" These entries suggested that Alexandra's murder may have been ordered not just to stop her from exposing Crawford Tech's financial improprieties, but to prevent her from uncovering the existence of Sentinel itself. a far more damaging revelation that would have implicated dozens of wealthy and powerful individuals beyond Marshall Crawford. The investigation into Sentinel's operations led to renewed interest in Alexandra's work with the Digital Accountability Project. Lily Zhang, now in her 70s, continued to lead the organization, which had evolved into one of the world's premier watchdog groups focused on corporate accountability and technology ethics. Alexandra understood before any of us that traditional regulatory frameworks were fundamentally inadequate for addressing the challenges posed by concentrated technological power, Zhang explained during a TED Talk that went viral. She recognized that when wealth becomes sufficiently concentrated, it inevitably seeks to rewrite the rules that govern society itself. The Digital Accountability Project had been instrumental in drafting what became known as the Alexandra Crawford Corporate Accountability Act of 2051, legislation that fundamentally reformed how corporate malfeasance was investigated and prosecuted. The Act created new criminal penalties for executives who knowingly enabled or benefited from corporate crimes, eliminated many of the jurisdictional barriers that had previously hampered investigations of multinational corporations, and established the most robust whistleblower protections in American history. This legislation is Alexandra's true legacy, Senator Maria Hernandez said during the floor debate. 28 years after her murder, she is still fighting to ensure that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, stands above the law. As prosecutors worked to unravel the full extent of Sentinel's operations, they discovered another disturbing connection. Evidence suggesting that elements within certain intelligence agencies had been aware of Sentinel's existence and had occasionally leveraged its capabilities for operations they couldn't legally conduct themselves. Sentinel operated in a grey zone that made it valuable to agencies facing legal constraints, testified a former intelligence official granted anonymity due to national security concerns. There were instances where information needed to be obtained or influence exerted without official fingerprints. Sentinel provided plausible deniability. This revelation prompted congressional hearings and calls for a comprehensive review of intelligence oversight mechanisms. The resulting legislation, the Intelligence Accountability Restoration Act, represented the most significant reform of American intelligence agencies since the 1970s. Meanwhile, James Whitman, continuing his work with the Renewal Foundation despite his advancing age, established the Alexandra Crawford Truth and Reconciliation Initiative, a program designed to create pathways for corporate whistleblowers and executives seeking to make amends for past wrongs. Alexandra's journey from unwitting complicity to courageous truth-telling offers a model for redemption that many in the corporate world desperately need. Whitman explained at the program's launch. She recognized that acknowledging your role in harmful systems is only the first step. True redemption requires working actively to dismantle those systems. The initiative attracted several high-profile participants, including former executives from companies implicated in the Sentinel investigation who chose to cooperate with authorities and share insider knowledge of corporate wrongdoing. Their testimonies led to further prosecutions and regulatory reforms across multiple industries. One of the most poignant moments in the ongoing Sentinel saga came when Diane Crawford, who had maintained a low profile since the revelations about her father's true role in Alexandra's murder, agreed to a joint interview with Thomas Parker, Alexandra's brother, on the 30th anniversary of her death. "I've carried the weight of that night for 30 years, Diane said, her voice steady despite the evident emotion. "I struck Alexandra in anger, believing I was protecting my family's legacy. I never imagined I was playing a role in something so much darker, a conspiracy that went far beyond anything I understood at the time." Parker, who had long refused to speak with Diane, described his journey toward a form of forgiveness. For decades, I blamed Diane almost as much as I blamed Marshall, he acknowledged. But as the truth about Sentinel emerged, I began to see her as another victim of her father's web of manipulation, not absolved of responsibility, but caught in something far bigger than she knew. The interview culminated in Diane's announcement that she was donating her entire inheritance, funds she had received through trusts established before her father's criminal convictions, to expand the Alexandra Crawford Whistleblower Fund. "I can never undo what happened," she said, "but I can ensure that Alexandra's work continues, that those who choose truth over loyalty to corrupt systems have the support they need to come forward." This act of contrition sparked debate about redemption and responsibility in an age increasingly concerned with systemic rather than merely individual accountability. Could someone who had participated in a harmful system, however unwittingly, truly make amends? The question remained unresolved, but Diane's actions represented an attempt to answer it affirmatively. As the fifth decade since Alexandra's murder approached, the full impact of the Sentinel revelations continued to reverberate through global politics, business, and law. The organization had been dismantled, many of its operatives prosecuted or forced into hiding, but the deeper questions it raised about wealth, power, and accountability remained urgently relevant. A documentary series titled Sentinel: The Shadow Power became the most watched program of 2052, exploring how the organization had influenced global events over 3 decades while remaining virtually unknown to the public. The series featured interviews with former operatives who had accepted immunity deals, clients who had turned state's evidence, and victims whose lives had been destroyed by Sentinel interventions. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation came from Sentinel's internal classification system for its clients. The organization had categorized its clientele into tiers, with alpha clients, those with sufficient resources and influence to be effectively untouchable, receiving services, unavailable to lower tiers. What Sentinel represented wasn't just criminal enterprise, but a fundamental challenge to the concept of equal justice, argued Professor Eliza Washington, a constitutional scholar who studied the case extensively. It created a parallel legal system where sufficient wealth could purchase immunity from laws that govern everyone else. The final episode of the documentary featured a virtual reconstruction of Alexandra Crawford's home office based on photographs and witness descriptions, where she had pieced together the clues that eventually led to her murder. The recreation included the journal entries, financial records, and news clippings she had collected as she followed the trail that led from her husband's business practices to the shadowy organization behind them. Alexandra Crawford died because she glimpsed a truth that threatened the most powerful people in the world, the narrator concluded. But in death, she accomplished what she could not in life, exposing not just individual corruption, but an entire shadow system designed to place wealth beyond accountability. As public fascination with the case continued, the Alexandra Crawford Community Center in Brooklyn expanded to include a museum dedicated to corporate accountability and the history of whistleblowing. The central exhibit featured an interactive timeline tracing Alexandra's journey from Treasury Department investigator to reluctant whistleblower. Visitors could also explore a digital archive of the Sentinel investigation, examining how wealth and power had been leveraged to create a parallel system of justice for those who could afford it. The exhibit ended with a simple question projected on the wall: what would you risk to expose the truth? This question, central to Alexandra's legacy, continued to challenge each new generation, confronting the perennial tensions between truth and power, between comfort and courage, between complicity and resistance. Alexandra's story resonates because it forces us to examine our own choices, reflected Lily Zhang in the foreword to a biography published on the 35th anniversary of her friend's death. Most of us will never face the stark choices she confronted, but we all participate in systems that cause harm. The question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge that complicity and work toward change, even when it costs us something. In an age of increasing technological surveillance, concentrated corporate power, and growing wealth inequality, Alexandra Crawford's legacy offered both warning and inspiration, a reminder that systems of impunity persist only when those within them choose silence over truth, security over justice, personal benefit over collective good. The final word on Alexandra's legacy perhaps belonged to James Whitman, who in the last interview before his death at age 92 reflected on the woman whose choices had shaped his life and the lives of so many others. Alexandra once told me that redemption isn't something you achieve, it's something you practice every day, he recalled. She understood that the past cannot be undone, but the future remains unwritten. Her courage didn't lie in being perfect. It lay in her willingness to confront her own complicity and then do something about it, regardless of the cost. In that sense, he concluded, her story isn't finished. It continues in everyone who sees injustice and speaks out, everyone who chooses truth over comfort, everyone who recognizes that real power lies not in wealth or influence, but in the courage to stand for what's right, even when standing alone. 40 years after Alexandra Crawford's murder, a new chapter in the story began in the most unexpected way. On June 17, 2063, the exact anniversary of her death, every major news organization worldwide simultaneously received an encrypted data package from an anonymous source. The file name was simply Harbinger. Initial attempts to access the files triggered sophisticated security protocols that required specialized decryption. When cybersecurity experts finally broke through the encryption, they discovered over 30 terabytes of data. Videos, audio recordings, documents and photographs meticulously organized into folders spanning nearly 4 decades. The sender identified himself as Wesley Lambert, the infamous Harbinger operative, who had allegedly died in the Thailand compound fire 15 years earlier. The accompanying message was brief but stunning. I did not die in Thailand. That was another operative who had assumed my identity at my direction, my final mission for what remained of Sentinel. I have spent the last 15 years documenting the full extent of Sentinel's operations and the individuals who enabled them. I do this not seeking redemption. There can be none for me, but because the truth must be known. I was the one who killed Alexandra Crawford. Now I will ensure her death continues to serve the cause of justice she died for. The authenticity of the files was initially questioned, but forensic analysis of the video content, metadata, and documentary evidence quickly confirmed their legitimacy. The Harbinger files, as they came to be known, represented the most comprehensive insider account of a shadow organization ever made public. Lambert had not only preserved Sentinel's operational records, but had continued gathering evidence long after the organization's official dissolution. Most significantly, he had recovered substantial portions of the archive, Sentinel's database of compromising information on global elites, which most investigators had assumed was destroyed when the organization collapsed. Lambert essentially became a one-man intelligence agency, explained Dr. Emma Torres, a former intelligence analyst who led an independent commission analyzing the files. He used his training and Sentinel's own methodologies to document the activities of former clients and operatives who had simply migrated to new structures after Sentinel's exposure. The files revealed that while Sentinel itself had been dismantled, Many of its most powerful clients had quickly established new, smaller, and more compartmentalized operations to continue their activities. Former Sentinel operatives had been recruited into these new entities, creating what Lambert described as Sentinel's children, organizations that maintained the same function while adopting more sophisticated security protocols to avoid detection. Most disturbingly, the files documented how technological advances in artificial intelligence, surveillance, and digital manipulation had made these successor organizations even more effective than Sentinel had been. Operations that once required teams of specialists could now be executed using automated systems with minimal human involvement, leaving virtually no traceable evidence. What Lambert documented wasn't just the persistence of Sentinel's methods, but their evolution into something far more insidious, noted cybersecurity expert Miguel Rodriguez. These new operations achieved perfect deniability by removing the human element almost entirely. Beyond the operational details, the Harbinger files contained Lambert's personal records spanning back to his recruitment by Sentinel in 2015. His detailed journals provided unprecedented insight into the psychology of someone who had devoted decades to serving the interests of the ultra-wealthy through increasingly unethical means. I joined believing I was protecting important people from legitimate threats, Lambert wrote in one entry from 2018. By the time I realized what Sentinel really was, an enforcement arm for a class of people who consider themselves above law, I was already implicated in too many operations to walk away. Lambert's account of Alexandra Crawford's murder was particularly chilling in its clinical detachment. He described receiving the assignment from Marshal Crawford through established channels, with the understanding that it should appear to be a robbery gone wrong. The unexpected appearance of Diane Crawford had forced him to adapt his approach, waiting until she left before completing his mission. The subject was still conscious when I approached, Lambert wrote in his operational log. She recognized that I wasn't Marshall despite the prosthetics. Her last words were, "He sent someone else to do it, coward." Then I delivered the final blow as instructed. It was my 73rd sanctioned elimination operation for Sentinel. Perhaps most valuable to investigators were Lambert's detailed records of Sentinel's client list. Not just the names that had already been exposed in previous investigations, but the full roster including clients who had successfully maintained their anonymity through complex legal firewalls. This list included prominent political figures from both major American parties, European industrialists, Middle Eastern royalty, Asian technology magnates, and Russian oligarchs. According to Lambert's records, Sentinel had executed operations in 47 countries, including assassinations disguised as accidents, elaborate blackmail schemes, and coordinated campaigns to destroy the reputations of journalists, activists, and whistleblowers. What emerges from these files is a portrait of global elite consensus that transcended traditional political and national boundaries, observed political scientist Dr. Hannah Chen. Individuals who publicly positioned themselves as adversaries were often using the same shadow services to eliminate common threats, particularly those who sought economic justice or corporate accountability. The Harbinger files prompted new investigations in multiple countries and led to a fresh wave of indictments against individuals who had previously escaped scrutiny. High-ranking politicians resigned, corporate boards were restructured, and several prominent billionaires faced criminal charges for the first time. For many who had followed the Crawford case over the decades, the most startling revelation came in Lambert's personal reflections on his victims, particularly Alexandra Crawford. "Of all the operations I conducted, Crawford haunts me the most," he wrote in 2045, 22 years after the murder. Not because she was innocent, most of my targets were, but because she alone seemed to understand the true nature of what she was fighting. She wasn't just exposing one man's corruption, but glimpsing an entire system designed to place wealth beyond accountability. In killing her, I was protecting not just Marshall Crawford, but the entire structure that allowed people like him to exist. Lambert's files included a detailed account of his surveillance of Alexandra in the weeks leading up to her murder. Surveillance that gave him a unique perspective on her growing awareness of Sentinel's existence. According to his logs, he had monitored her communications, tracked her movements, and even planted listening devices in her personal spaces at Crawford's request. "She's methodical, careful," he noted in one surveillance report. "She's constructing her case like the federal investigator she once was, gathering evidence not just of financial crimes, but of the enforcement mechanism behind them. She's found references to Sentinel in Marshall's encrypted files and is attempting to identify patterns in incidents involving his business rivals. If she continues, she will eventually connect the dots." This confirmation that Alexandra had been on the verge of exposing Sentinel itself, not just her husband's financial crimes, added new significance to her murder. She had been eliminated not merely for threatening one powerful man, but for potentially exposing an entire shadow system serving the global elite. Lambert's files also contained information he had gathered about Alexandra from his surveillance. Personal journals, emails to close friends, and recorded conversations that offered glimpses into her state of mind during her final weeks. These private thoughts, now made public with Lambert's commentary, painted a portrait of a woman coming to terms with her own complicity and finding the courage to act despite overwhelming fear. "I built a life on lies," she wrote in a journal. Entry Lambert had photographed. "First, the lie about the accident to protect James, then the lie of my marriage to Marshall, pretending not to know what kind of man he really is. Each compromise led to another until I barely recognized myself. When does it end? When do I finally stand for something, even if it costs me everything?" Another entry, dated just 3 days before her death. "I'm afraid all the time now. I know Marshall has people watching me. I feel eyes everywhere. But the fear of remaining silent has finally become greater than the fear of speaking out. Whatever happens next, at least I'll be able to face myself in the mirror again." These intimate glimpses into Alexandra's final days transformed public understanding of her story. She was no longer seen simply as a victim of domestic violence or a whistleblower who had uncovered her husband's crimes, but as someone who had made a conscious choice to expose corruption despite knowing the likely consequences. Alexandra Crawford faced the ultimate test of moral courage, commented ethics professor Dr. Jonathan Miller in a documentary about the Harbinger files. She recognized that her privileged life was built on a foundation of exploitation and abuse, of power, and she chose truth over comfort, justice over security, integrity over survival. Beyond the revelations about the Crawford case, Lambert's files documented how Sentinel and its successor organizations had shaped global events over 4 decades. Electoral outcomes had been influenced through targeted blackmail of candidates or strategic release of damaging information. Corporate competitions had been decided by orchestrated scandals or carefully planned accidents befalling key executives. Regulatory decisions had been manipulated through pressure on officials or their family members. "The scale of influence is staggering," noted journalist Elena Mirza, who led a global consortium of news organizations analyzing the files. "We're not talking about conspiracy theories, but documented operations affecting everything from pharmaceutical regulations to climate policy, from antitrust decisions to international trade agreements." The files revealed how Sentinel had established specialized units focused on different forms of intervention. The Harbinger Division that Lambert had belonged to handled physical eliminations. The Cassandra Division specialized in reputation, destruction through coordinated disinformation campaigns. The Prometheus Division focused on stealing and weaponizing information through cyber operations. Sentinel essentially industrialized corruption and influence, explained former prosecutor Samuel Washington. They took methods that had existed throughout history: bribery, blackmail, intimidation, elimination, and applied corporate efficiency principles to create a streamlined service for the ultra-wealthy. Lambert's files included one final devastating component: detailed manuals and guidelines for the successor organizations that had replaced Sentinel. These documents outlined sophisticated methods for avoiding the mistakes that had led to Sentinel's exposure, including advanced operational security protocols, technological countermeasures, and legal structures designed to create perfect deniability. Lambert's final act wasn't just exposing what Sentinel had done, but providing a blueprint for preventing such organizations from operating in the future, noted cybersecurity expert Dr. Lisa Yamamoto. He documented exactly how these operations avoid detection, giving regulators and investigators the knowledge they need to identify similar patterns. The question of Lambert's own fate remained unanswered. The files had been transmitted automatically according to program protocols, with no indication of his current whereabouts or whether he was still alive. The final entry in his personal journal, dated 1 month before the file's release, suggested, "He did not expect to survive the disclosure. I have no illusions about redemption. There can be none for someone who has taken so many lives in service to power. This archive is not atonement, but testimony, evidence of a system I helped build and now help dismantle." Alexandra Crawford died trying to expose the truth. "Perhaps there is some justice in my using the skills that made me her killer to continue the work," she began. Global reaction to the Harbinger files transformed the Alexandra Crawford case from a historical true crime narrative into an urgent contemporary issue. The revelations about ongoing operations by Sentinel's successors prompted legislation in multiple countries, specifically targeting private intelligence and strategic services firms. Regulatory frameworks were established requiring unprecedented transparency from organizations providing security or intelligence services to private clients. The Alexandra Crawford Center for Corporate Accountability, established decades earlier, became the central clearinghouse for analyzing and disseminating information from the Harbinger files. Under the direction of Lily Zhang's granddaughter, Dr. Rebecca Zhang, the center launched a global initiative to identify and expose operations following the Sentinel model. "These files have given us the playbook," Dr. Zhang explained during a United Nations presentation. "For the first time, we know exactly how wealth evades accountability on a global scale. The question now is whether we have the collective will to close these loopholes permanently." Public discourse around the case increasingly focused on the structural conditions that had allowed Sentinel to thrive. Economic inequality, regulatory capture, jurisdictional limitations, and technological acceleration had all created an environment where wealth could effectively purchase immunity from legal and social constraints. Sentinel wasn't an aberration, but the logical extension of trends that continue today, argued economist Dr. Marcus Johnson. As long as we maintain systems where wealth can accumulate without limit, while democratic institutions remain underfunded and constrained, organizations like Sentinel will continue to emerge, regardless of what we call them. The final chapter of Wesley Lambert's journal offered a stark assessment of this reality, I have documented every operation, named every client, exposed every method. But I harbor no illusions that this alone will prevent similar organizations from emerging. As long as immense wealth exists alongside democratic governance, the former will seek to control the latter. The Sentinel model persists because it fulfills a market demand that never disappears, the demand of power to operate without constraint. 50 years after her death, Alexandra Crawford's legacy had evolved far beyond the specifics of her murder. She had become a symbol of resistance against corrupted power. Her story, taught in schools as an example of moral courage and the personal cost of standing for truth. The community centers bearing her name had expanded to more than 30 locations worldwide, each one dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and promoting corporate accountability. The Alexandra Crawford Prize for Ethical Courage had become one of the world's most prestigious awards, recognizing individuals who took significant personal risks to expose wrongdoing by powerful interests. In a society increasingly concerned about the concentration of wealth and power in fewer hands, her story provided both warning and inspiration, a reminder that systems of impunity persist only when those within them choose silence over truth, comfort over courage, complicity over conscience. Alexandra Crawford's murder wasn't just a crime, but a message, reflected Thomas Parker in his final interview before his death at age 92. It was meant to show that no one could challenge the powerful and survive. But 50 years later, her name is remembered, while those who sought to silence her are known only for their crimes. The ultimate legacy of my sister's death, he concluded, is the reminder that even the most sophisticated machinery of silencing cannot in the end overcome the power of a single person willing to stand for truth, no matter the cost. In the summer of 2073, 50 years after Alexandra Crawford's murder, the world's attention turned once again to the case that had shaped a half-century of corporate accountability efforts. The Alexandra Crawford Foundation was preparing for a global summit, marking the 50th anniversary of her death, bringing together whistleblowers, corporate reformers, and government officials from around the world. What no one expected was that the anniversary would bring one final revelation, perhaps the most significant of all. 3 months before the summit, Rebecca Zhang, granddaughter of Alexandra's friend Lily and now director of the Alexandra Crawford Center for Corporate Accountability, received an unusual package. It contained a single item, an antique jewelry box that had once belonged to Alexandra, lost since the night of her murder. The box itself wasn't particularly valuable, Zhang later explained to investigators, but according to family stories, my grandmother always said Alexandra kept her most important secrets in plain sight. Inside the box was a single microchip of outdated design, accompanied by a handwritten note yellowed with age, the paper fragile and thin. When the Harbinger speaks, use this, AC. Forensic analysis confirmed the handwriting matched Alexandra's, and the paper dated to the early 2020s. The chip contained an encrypted file that initially resisted all attempts at decryption until specialists applied the exact text from Wesley Lambert's Harbinger Files confession as the decryption key. The file opened to reveal what Alexandra had called the cipher, a comprehensive mapping of financial relationships she had constructed during her final year of life. Beginning with her husband's companies and extending outward, she had meticulously documented the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated entities: investment firms, charitable foundations, technology companies, media conglomerates, and political action committees. Alexandra wasn't just documenting her husband's financial crimes, explained financial forensics expert Dr. Jason Powell. She was mapping what we would now call a capture network, the systematic way wealth influences every aspect of society. through strategic investments and relationships. The cipher was far ahead of its time, anticipating analytical methods that wouldn't be developed by financial crime specialists for another decade. It showed how Marshall Crawford's influence extended far beyond his official holdings, creating what Alexandra had labeled leverage points throughout the political and economic system. Most significantly, the cipher included a section titled Sentinel Genesis, Alexandra's reconstruction of how the organization had been formed. According to her research, Sentinel hadn't been Crawford's creation alone, but a collaborative venture between 7 billionaires from different industries who had recognized a common need for problem resolution beyond legal constraints. They call it protective services, Alexandra had written, but what they've really created is a privatized intelligence agency answering only to capital. No oversight, no accountability, no limitations beyond what they impose on themselves. The cipher included documentation of early Sentinel operations that predated Alexandra's marriage to Marshall, operations that had never been exposed even in Lambert's comprehensive files. These included the orchestrated downfall of a promising green energy company whose technology threatened fossil fuel interests, the strategic breakdown of labor organizing efforts in multiple industries, and coordinated campaigns to influence judicial appointments at state and federal levels. Most disturbingly, the cipher contained evidence suggesting Sentinel's earliest operations had included a trial run of what would later become standard practice, the staged suicide of a journalist investigating connections between Crawford's early ventures and organized crime figures. She was building a RICO case, noted former prosecutor Elizabeth Morales, referring to the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Not just against her husband, but against the entire Sentinel founder group. She was treating them as an organized crime syndicate, which in essence is exactly what they were. The question that immediately arose: how had Alexandra compiled this information, and how had the jewelry box and its crucial contents remained hidden for 50 years? The answer came from an unexpected source. 1 week after the cipher's discovery, 93-year-old Madison Wells, Alexandra's former personal assistant now living in a retirement community in Arizona, requested a meeting with Rebecca Zhang. Alexandra knew she was being watched, Wells explained, her mind still sharp despite her advanced age. She knew her digital activities were being monitored, her phones tapped, her movements tracked, so she went analog for her most sensitive work. According to Wells, Alexandra had established an elaborate system for gathering and storing information outside digital channels. She had used cash to purchase burner phones, conducted research using public library computers, and stored physical copies of documents in multiple locations under various pretexts. The jewelry box was her backup plan, Wells revealed. She gave it to me 2 days before she died, with specific instructions. If anything happened to her, I should hide it somewhere safe and wait until I received a specific signal before bringing it forward. That signal, according to Wells, was to be the public revelation of Sentinel's full operations and client list, precisely what the Harbinger files had provided 50 years later. She told me, when the truth about the shadow behind the shadows comes out, that's when you'll know it's time. I honestly never thought I'd live to see it happen. Wells had kept the box hidden for decades, first in a remote family cabin, and later in a nondescript storage unit registered under a different name. She had carried Alexandra's secret through her entire adult life, watching as the case unfolded across decades, waiting for the moment when the final piece could safely emerge. I wasn't the only one, Wells added. Alexandra created a network of people who each held different pieces of the puzzle. Most have died now, but we all kept our promises to her. This revelation transformed understanding of Alexandra's final year. Far from being a lone whistleblower, overwhelmed by forces beyond her control, she had been the architect of a sophisticated long-term strategy, one designed to ensure that even her death would advance her ultimate goal of exposing systemic corruption. Alexandra knew she might not survive, Rebecca Zhang explained during a press conference announcing the cipher's discovery. But she engineered a dead man's switch that would continue operating long after she was gone. A cascade of revelations timed to unfold across decades. The cipher's release prompted new investigations into surviving members of what Alexandra had called the founder group, the original billionaires who had established Sentinel. Though most had died, their financial and influence networks had persisted through family offices, foundations, and corporate structures that continued to shape global politics and economics. A joint task force comprising representatives from financial intelligence units in 12 countries began the painstaking work of comparing Alexandra's 50-year-old financial mapping with current ownership structures, tracing how the influence networks she had identified had evolved over generations. "What we're finding is astonishing continuity," reported Special Agent Teresa Gonzalez. "The specific individuals have changed, but the architectural framework Alexandra documented remains largely intact. The mechanisms through which wealth shapes policy, captures regulators, and neutralizes threats have been refined but not fundamentally altered. The cipher provided a missing evolutionary link between the corruption of previous eras and the sophisticated influence systems of the present day. It showed how techniques that had once required explicit conspiracy had been gradually institutionalized into seemingly legitimate structures: policy institutes, academic endowments, media conglomerates, and philanthropic foundations that collectively ensured private interests maintained primacy over public good. Alexandra wasn't just documenting specific crimes, noted sociologist Dr. Marcus Wilson. She was mapping the emergence of what we now call structural capture, systems designed to ensure that regardless of which political party holds power, which regulators are appointed, or which laws are passed, the fundamental distribution of power remains unchanged. The final section of the cipher, titled simply Beyond, contained Alexandra's reflections on the implications of what she had discovered, reflections that proved remarkably prescient about developments that would unfold over the following half-century. "The challenge isn't just exposing individual bad actors," she had written. "It's confronting a system designed at every level to convert wealth into power and power into immunity from consequence. Sentinel is merely the enforcement arm of something much larger, a comprehensive architecture that transforms democracy into a managed spectacle while preserving concentrated power." She had outlined potential countermeasures, many of which anticipated reforms that would later be implemented through legislation bearing her name: robust whistleblower protections, strengthened anti-corruption statutes, transparency requirements for beneficial ownership, and public financing of elections. Most strikingly, Alexandra had recognized that legal and regulatory approaches alone would be insufficient. "This is ultimately a struggle over narrative," she wrote. "Do we accept a world where wealth justifies itself simply by existing, where power is its own legitimation? Or do we insist on measuring both their impact on human flourishing and ecological health?" This philosophical dimension of Alexandra's work had largely been overlooked in previous accounts that focused on the sensational aspects of her murder. The cipher revealed her not just as a whistleblower exposing specific crimes, but as a profound moral thinker, grappling with fundamental questions about power, accountability, and the purpose of economic systems. She understood that corruption isn't just a deviation from an otherwise functional system, observed political philosopher Dr. Amara Singh. It's the inevitable outcome when we allow wealth to concentrate beyond democratic accountability. What makes her analysis so remarkable is that she reached these conclusions from inside the system, through direct observation rather than theoretical analysis. The discovery of the cipher coincided with the global summit marking the 50th anniversary of Alexandra's death. Originally planned as a retrospective on progress made in corporate accountability, the summit quickly transformed into a forward-looking examination of how Alexandra's final insights could inform contemporary challenges. The keynote address, delivered by Sophia Chen, now in her 70s, and the legendary journalist who had broken the Sentinel story decades earlier, placed Alexandra's legacy in historical context. 50 years ago, a woman raised in middle-class America who found herself transplanted into unimaginable wealth made a choice that would transform global capitalism. Rather than enjoying the privileges her position afforded her, she used that position to document precisely how wealth corrupts the systems designed to constrain it. In doing so, Chen continued, she initiated a multi-generational project of exposing and reforming the hidden architecture of power. This project has unfolded across 50 years, not because of dramatic revolutions or sudden transformations, but through the patient, persistent work of building alternative systems that prioritize transparency, accountability, and shared prosperity. The summit concluded with the announcement of the Alexandra Crawford Transparency Initiative, a collaborative effort between global financial intelligence units, journalistic organizations, and civil society groups to create real-time mapping of influence networks modeled on Alexandra's original cipher methodology, but enhanced with contemporary data science capabilities. We're finally building the tools Alexandra envisioned 50 years ago, explained Project Director Dr. Noah Kim. Systems that can make visible the hidden relationships between wealth, influence, and policy outcomes, not to demonize success or wealth creation, but to ensure that power, regardless of its source, remains accountable to democratic principles. In the months following the summit, a curious pattern emerged. Anonymous donors began establishing what came to be called Alexandra Crawford Chairs at universities worldwide. These endowed positions were dedicated to researching systemic corruption and developing curricula that integrated understanding of influence networks into various disciplines: law, economics, political science, journalism, and computer science. By the following year, more than 50 such positions had been created, forming an informal global network of academics dedicated to continuing Alexandra's work of exposing and reforming the structures that enable corruption. The donors remain anonymous, but financial forensics suggested the funds had been redirected from some of the same fortune-derived foundations Alexandra had mapped in the cipher. Perhaps the ultimate irony in her complex legacy, public fascination. With the Crawford case, underwent a final transformation with the discovery of the cipher. Alexandra was no longer seen primarily as a victim or even as a whistleblower, but as a visionary who had recognized emerging threats to democratic governance before they became widely apparent. A portrait of Alexandra, painted from photographs by renowned artist Miguel Santos, was unveiled at the National Portrait Gallery with a simple inscription, Alexandra Crawford, 1990-2023. She saw clearly what others could not yet imagine. The final piece of Alexandra's story emerged a year after the cipher's discovery, when renovations at the old Crawford estate in Southampton uncovered a sealed letter hidden within a wall cavity. Forensic analysis confirmed it had been written by Alexandra the night before her murder, a final testimony she had hidden in the home where she would die. "If you're reading this, I'm gone," the letter began. "I've arranged for the truth to emerge in stages, each revelation building on the last. This was not from lack of courage, but from strategic necessity. Some truths can only be understood when people are ready to hear them. She continued with remarkable prescience. I do not know who will kill me, my husband directly or someone acting on his behalf. But I know why I will die. Not just because I discovered his crimes, but because I glimpsed the larger system those crimes serve and support. That glimpse is unforgivable to those who benefit from keeping such systems hidden. The letter concluded with words that would be inscribed on memorials around the world, a final testament to the power of individual conscience against seemingly overwhelming forces. I was complicit before I was courageous. I benefited before I bore witness. I chose comfort until I could no longer bear the cost of that choice. If my story offers any lesson, let it be this. It is never too late to reclaim your integrity, to stand for truth even when that stand is dangerous. The systems that appear all-powerful persist only because we accept their inevitability. The moment enough of us withdraw that acceptance, their power begins to crumble. I die knowing I have set something in motion that cannot be stopped, not because I am extraordinary, but because truth, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. Others will carry this forward in ways I cannot imagine. To them, I say, you are not alone. Your courage is not in vain. The arc of this story may extend beyond individual lifetimes, but its direction leads toward justice. 60 years after a wealthy New York socialite was murdered for secretly diverting her husband's fortune, her final message resonated with a world still grappling with the tension between concentrated wealth and democratic governance, between power and accountability, between the comfort of complicity and the cost of courage. In life, Alexandra Crawford had moved between worlds, from middle-class America to the heights of wealth and privilege, from unwitting complicity to determined resistance. In death, she had triggered a cascade of revelations that spanned generations, each building upon the last to expose increasingly fundamental truths about how power operates in modern society. Her story had begun as a lurid tale of murder among the elite, a wealthy woman killed for secreting away her husband's millions. It had evolved into a complex narrative of corporate accountability, whistleblowing, and the struggle for justice against overwhelming odds. But its final form transcended both these frameworks, becoming instead a multi-generational parable about the responsibility each person bears to confront systemic injustice, regardless of their position within it. Alexandra Crawford's greatest insight wasn't about specific financial crimes or even about Sentinel itself, reflected ethics professor Dr. Sarah Martinez in the closing moments of a documentary commemorating the 60th anniversary of her death. It was the recognition that systems of injustice persist not through their inherent strength, but through our collective willingness to participate in them, to look away from uncomfortable truths, to choose personal security over shared justice. Her legacy challenges each of us with a question that transcends her specific time and circumstances, Martinez continued. When we glimpse the truth about systems that cause harm, whether in our workplaces, our communities, or our global economic structures, will we choose the safety of silence or the risk of speaking out? Will we prioritize our individual comfort or our collective humanity? In the end, Alexandra Crawford's story was not merely about a murder that exposed a hidden organization serving the ultra-wealthy. It was about the transformative power of moral courage, the capacity of a single person, acting from conscience rather than self-interest, to initiate changes that unfold across decades, affecting millions of lives in ways they themselves might never witness. Her final message, hidden in the walls of the home where she died, had waited patiently for 6 decades before emerging into the light. just as the truths she had uncovered had waited for the world to become ready to confront them. In this patience, perhaps, lay the most profound lesson of her legacy, that justice, while often delayed by power, persists in the human conscience, awaiting its moment to emerge. As the light faded on the 60th anniversary of her death, visitors to the Alexandra Crawford Memorial in Central Park paused before the simple stone marker that bore her final words. Among them was a young woman who placed a single rose beside the inscription. When asked by a nearby journalist why she had come, she smiled slightly. "Because her story isn't finished," she replied. "It continues in anyone who chooses truth over comfort, justice over security, courage over complicity. Today, that might be me. Tomorrow it might be you, but someone always carries it forward." She walked away before the journalist could ask her name, another anonymous participant in the ongoing story Alexandra had begun. A story without end, passed from generation to generation, of the eternal struggle between power and accountability, between those who would rule without constraint and those who insist that no one stands above justice. In that continuing struggle, Alexandra Crawford's voice echoes still, not as a distant historical figure, but as a contemporary challenge. To each person who encounters her story, what truth will you speak? What stand will you take? What cost are you willing to bear for the world you wish to create? These questions, like the woman who first posed them through her life and death, transcend their origins to become something universal. A reminder that in every era, the true measure of a society lies not in the power it concentrates, but in the courage it cultivates, not in the wealth it generates, but in the justice it ensures, not in the comfort it provides for some, but in the dignity it preserves for all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.